Let's begin by reading the angel-related section of chapter 1 of Hebrews, starting at verse 5 and continuing to the end of the chapter. I don't know whether we'll actually get to the end of the chapter tonight, but last week we made enormous progress getting through an entire verse and a half. So we'll see how we do tonight.
Okay.
So, chapter 1, verse 5. For to what angel did God ever say, "You are my son, today I have begotten you"? Or again, "I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son"? And again, when he brings the firstborn into the world, he says, "Let all God's angels worship him." Of the angels, he says, "Who makes his angels winds and his servants flames of fire." But of the Son, he says, "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The righteous scepter is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated lawlessness. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness beyond your comrades. And you, Lord, founded the earth in the beginning, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will all grow old like a garment. Like a cloak, you will roll them up, and they will be changed. But you are the same, and your years will never end. But to what angel has he ever said, "Sit at my right hand till I make your enemies a stool for your feet"? Are they not all ministering spirits sent forth to serve for the sake of those who are to obtain salvation? So we finished last week the first part of verse 6. And again, when he brings the firstborn into the world, he says, "Let all God's angels worship him." So we're up to "let all God's angels worship him." Mary Healy attributes this as being kind of a combination verse, use of Psalm 97 from the Septuagint and of Deuteronomy 32, chapter 32, verse 43, the prayer of Moses from the Septuagint.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly, it's not really from either of those. It's from yet another book of the Septuagint, which is found in the Eastern Orthodox Bibles, but not in the Latin version of the Septuagint, not in the Vulgate as it's passed on to us, not in most of the available translations of the Septuagint. So I actually had to do a good deal of some digging to find it. But it turns out that there's a publishing house. It's called the Scriptural Research Institute. And they publish individual books of the Septuagint. And then they publish apocryphal works, both Jewish and Christian. So the books of Enoch. There's, I think, an Apocalypse of Abraham. There are a number of books in that genre that they publish, which are at least, sort of really valuable. So in any case, this quotation comes from the Odes in the Septuagint.
Say that word again.
The Odes, O-D-E-S. So there are 14 odes in the Septuagint. They come after the Psalms, and they're basically sort of adaptations of some part of the Bible for worship. So they're sort of, to be viewed as psalms themselves that are used, or songs, chants that are used in worship. And so this quotation is taken directly without modification from the second ode. it follows after a praise to Yahweh. Immediately before it, it says, the Lord asked, where are their gods in whom they trusted? And then talks about God bringing judgment and wrath on those worshiping other gods. And then it reads, rejoice, you heavens, with him, and let all the angels of God worship him. Rejoice, you Gentiles, with his people, and let all the sons of God strengthen themselves in him. He will avenge the blood of his sons, and he will render vengeance and recompense justice to his enemies, and will reward them that hate him. And the Lord will purge the land of his people. So, rejoice, you heavens, with him, and let all the angels of God worship him. Then rejoice, you Gentiles, with his people. So it's an ode about the power of God, the victory of God, and his bringing, and it's being worshiped not only by all of the heavens, by the angels, but also by his people and by the Gentiles. So in the Old Testament, the ode and if you want to base it on Deuteronomy or Psalm 97, those refer to worship due God alone. So does anyone have any sense of how we can drag the Son into this?
Well, the Son is God.
Uh-huh.
And he mentions them right at the beginning of that.
The Son is God, although also remember that that's a point that he's trying to prove.
Mm-hmm.
When we finish this section, when we finish this verse, we'll pause for a moment to see how well he's actually proven that and what is the strength of his argument and what seems to be the weakness so far, and then we'll go on.
Okay.
Because, I mean, in some sense, he's building his argument incrementally. So it's kind of like a growing crescendo, and he's not done yet.
Well, he's definitely saying that Jesus is above the angels.
Right. Uh-huh. Right. So given that this applies that traditionally in the Hebrew script, well, this isn't the Hebrew scriptures, but traditionally in the Septuagint, this applies to God alone. And there is no Son or no notion or concept of a Son. How do we end up deriving a Son out of this?
And we're just looking down to 7, right? So from 6 to 7.
At the moment, we're just looking at 6, 7. Verse 7 is
It's about the angels, showing that the Son is above the angels.
Right. We're looking at 6. Then we'll examine 7, and then we'll stop to examine how his argument is working so far. And then we'll examine 8, which is that next quotation is sort of a very, increases the volume of a mounting crescendo.
So ask your question again.
It was so
I
good. You
lost my train.
should have written it down.
So the question is, that's a very good question. I like that question.
Something
And,
about bringing in his Son into this.
Right. So that's good. Thank you, Carmen. Right. So the question is,
That's
in
okay.
the-
I'm
in-
just as puzzled as everybody.
in the Septuagint, this is seen as relating to God, who is the one true God. And so how do we drag a son into this? How do we derive, the existence of a son? How do we use this to, prove that the son is superior to, that the son even exists, much less that he's superior to the angels?
Well, it started in 5, if not before. For to what angel did God ever say, thou art my son, today I've begotten you?
Right.
I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son.
Hmm.
Never said that about the angels. So he's giving the title right there.
Right.
Then he's asking the angels to worship him. And in the Septuagint, the Gentiles too.
Hmm. Right. And so remember, there are two things, sort of going on here, or there are two things that he has to try to show. The first is that there is a son, period. And that's a very difficult concept within the context of Judaism. The Lord our God is one, the Shema Israel. And then the second is that the Son is higher than the angels. If there is a Son, the Son is higher than the angels. So those are difficult, and in some ways, the first one is difficult, is the most difficult, because if the Son exists, it becomes easier to prove that the Son is higher than the angels. But if the Son doesn't exist, obviously the Son can't be just higher than the angels, because there is none.
Mhm. I think by putting 5 with 6, it builds.
It builds, right?
Mhm.
Right. It builds. But also, so going back to that ode, and although in some ways the odes have really, particularly in the Western church, have been lost from Christian worship, the odes continue to be significant for Christian worship in the Eastern church, and continue to be a part of the Eastern Orthodox Bibles. So going back to the Psalm, you read the section right before the section that he draws his quotation from. So it reads, the Lord asked, where are their gods in whom they trusted? He's talking about those who worship, engage in idolatry, who worship false God. The fat of whose sacrifices you ate, and you drank the wine of their drink offerings. Let them rise and help you and be your protectors. Obviously, they can't rise and help you and be your protectors because they don't exist. Look that I am he, and there is no God beside me. I kill, and I will make live. I will kill, and I will heal. None will deliver out of my hands. For I will lift my hand to the sky and swear by my right hand, and I will say, I live forever. I will sharpen my sword like lightning. My hand will take hold of judgment. I will render judgment to my enemies and will recompense them that hate me. I will make my weapons drunk with blood, and my sword will devour flesh. It will glut itself with the blood of the wounded, and from the captivity of the heads of their enemies that rule over them. Rejoice, you heavens, with him, and let all the angels of God worship him. Rejoice, you Gentiles, with his people. and let all the sons of God strengthen themselves in him. He will avenge the blood of his sons, and he will render vengeance and recompense justice to his enemies, and will reward them that hate him. And the Lord will purge the land of his people. So it's a little bit gory, but nevertheless, it's an ode of victory and an ode of judgment and an ode of the triumph of God. So where have we heard that in so far in the letter to the Hebrews? And the triumph, the victory.
That be verse 3. We're speaking of the
Mhm.
both through the
Right.
prophets and now through
Mhm.
a son who is the radiance of his glory.
Or actually a little, the second part of the verse. When he had made purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high.
Yeah.
So that's a statement of victory. It kind of parallels the ode. So the basic reasoning here is that worship is due God alone. That's clear from the traditional interpretation of the ode by Greek-speaking Jews. Let all the angels of God worship him. They're supposed to worship what in Christian terminology we would term God the Father. Worship cannot be given an angel and is not due an angel. In fact, it's the other way around. Angels worship God. God also has a son. Because he's not an angel and he's worthy of worship, the Son must be God. And how do we know that the Son is God? Because the Son has the same status with God, the Father, as a firstborn son would have with his father. And he therefore receives the privileges of his father. And so the Son is exalted and enthroned over the entire creation, including the angelic realm. The Son has brought victory in the same way that in the Ode, God brings victory and vindicates his people. The Son has brought victory and has vindicated his people. So that ode, this ode 2, the second ode in the book of Odes, is a variation of, is drawn from Moses' prayer in Deuteronomy. And so remember that Moses is intimately associated with the Exodus event, right, where God intervenes to set his people free. And the angels lead Moses and lead God's people. According to Hebrew tradition, the angels present the law to Moses. They're the mediators of the Mosaic law. And so there's a close relationship between God and angels, but one can't confuse Moses with God.
Mhm.
Right? Moses is clearly subservient to the angels. And angels can worship God alone. Now, on the other hand, Jesus sets his people free through purification from sin. And he does that because he's heir, because he's the Son. And therefore, angels worship the Son, who is the heir, who bears the imprint of God, who has the same power of God, and who makes purification for sins. So if we go back to Deuteronomy, verse 43,
Chapter,
32. So this is basically follows the leading of the people of God into promised land or near the promised land, their freedom from slavery in Egypt. And then the text says, rejoice, you heavens, with him, and let all the angels of God worship him. Rejoice, you Gentiles, with his people, and let all the sons of God strengthen themselves in him. For he will avenge the blood of his sons. He will render vengeance and recompense justice to his enemies, will reward them that hate him. And the Lord shall purge the land of his people. So God is celebrated for the deliverance of his people. And so the angels, because of that, worship him. Let all the angels of God worship him because he is the deliverer. Jesus, the Son, is the deliverer. He sat down at the right hand of God to make purification for sins. And therefore, he is worthy of worship by the angels. So an ode or a Moses song that applies to Yahweh then applies to the Son. So that
so if
was
I were
just,
to say they're both doing it by their own power without the help of angels, delivering freedom to people,
right.
then that makes them both qualified to be worshiped by angels.
They both deliver out of their own power,
Okay,
as opposed to angels who act out of the power of God. Angels don't really have their own power in that sense. They're messengers. And then we have of the angels, he says, who makes his angels winds and his servants flames of fire. That's from Psalm 104. This is a psalm of God's creative power and God's role in the creation. It's very powerful, and for us, it should be very humbling. It really speaks to the theology of creation, which is something that we often forget about as we sort of focus on the theology of salvation, where we shift the focus from God and God as the creator of all things, including ourselves, to ourselves and the issue of our personal salvation. This is from the Septuagint version of Psalm 104. Let's begin by reading the Masoretic text, and we'll read through verse 4. Bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord my God, you are very great. You are clothed with honor and majesty, who cover yourself with light as with a garment, who have stretched out the heavens like a tent, who have laid the beams of your chambers on the waters, who make the clouds your chariot, who ride on the wings of the wind, who make the winds your messengers, fire and flame your ministers. I'm tempted to go on, but we can stop there. This is a really beautiful psalm. So that verse 4, though, in the Septuagint reads differently. Instead of making the winds your messengers, fire and flame your ministers, it reads, who makes his angels winds and his servants flames of fire. So he's drawing once again on the Septuagint. So notice in the last verse, the end of the last verse, he's drawing on the Odes from the Septuagint, the exact translation, the exact wording of the Odes in the Septuagint of Ode 2. Here again, he's drawing once again on the Septuagint version of Psalm 104 and not on the version of the Masoretic text. That's a typical, and that's something that the author does again and again. He doesn't draw on the Masoretic text. He draws on the Septuagint. So it's a psalm of creation, a psalm of giving glory to God for his creation, of praise to God as the master and the Lord of all creation. Let's read a little bit more. The entire context of the psalm is significant. Let's start at verse 14. You cause the grass to grow for the cattle and plants for man to cultivate, that he may bring forth food from the earth and wine to gladden the heart of man, oil to make his face shine and bread to strengthen man's heart. The trees of the Lord are watered abundantly, the cedars of Lebanon which he planted. In them the birds build their nests, the stork has her home in the fir trees. The high mountains are for the wild goats, the rocks are a refuge for the badgers. You have made the moon to mark the seasons, the sun knows its time for setting. You make darkness and it is night, where all the beasts of the forest creep forth. The young lions roar for their prey, seeking their food from God. When the sun rises, they get them away and lie down in their dens. Man goes forth to his work and to his labor until the evening. O Lord, how manifold are your works. In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. Yonder is a sea great and wide, which teems with things innumerable, living things, both great and small. We can stop there. But the point here is that the Lord has created the earth and all of the living things in it. He's created them partly for the use of man, but also because they have intrinsic value in themselves. The lions roaring and looking for their prey at night, the mountain goats in the mountains, the stork, the birds in the trees, they all have intrinsic value. They all have intrinsic dignity because they're all things which God has created. They're all living beings that God has called into being. And in the midst of all of that creative activity, the angels are his winds and flames of fire. So they're messengers, they're servants. Nothing has been really, the psalm doesn't mention anything created for their benefit. Instead, the fruits of the earth are created for the benefit of God's creation, of God's creatures, of man and of other living things in the air, of living animals on the ground, of living beings in the sea. So the activity of the angels corresponds to God's will and direction. So God, who makes the angels winds and his servants flames of fire, God is the active creator who makes them. So they're elemental forces, just like wind, just like water, just like fire. And so the wind and the fire become instruments for theophany. And one of the Targums, the interpretation of Psalm 104, is who makes his angels as swift as the wind, his servants as mighty as flaming fire. So the angels are superior beings. The angels are very exalted beings. But the angels are not God. The angels are only servants. They play a subservient role. So the angels are immeasurably superior to man, but they're not immutable. So winds die down, flames are put out. The angels have a beginning. Chrysostom stresses the makes in the quotation from the psalm. Who makes his angels winds of fire is not made.
In our Healy book, I thought the term was good. It affirms the reality of the angels and their noble functions, but also their subordinate status to Jesus. That noble function, I thought, was a good way of putting it.
Right. Noble function, they're exalted beings.
So above us,
they are in the presence of God. They do the will of God,
which we don't always do.
which we have some difficulty with in a variety of areas. Recognizing it in the first place and then doing it. So exalted beings, but still superior to us, but not to the Son. So overall, through these first 7 verses, so we're halfway through the chapter, how is the author of Hebrews doing in proving his case and establishing his case? So the argument is, his most explicit argument is that the Son is superior to the angels. But underlying that, in order for the Son to be superior to the angels, there has to be a Son. So, if the Son goes poof, then all of this is silly. So how strong is his argument and how is he doing? And where do you see the strengths and the weaknesses? Does anyone have any ideas how would we to evaluate this?
One of his main strengths is calling him his heir, because in the Jewish tradition at that time, that showed his power right there, and his he had the same status as the Father then.
Mm-hmm.
And then talking about how he's higher than the angels. The Jewish tradition was very strong on angels at that time.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So I think he's laying out a step by step.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what the weakness is.
Mm-hmm. Good. Anyone else have any ideas? Anyone else know what the weaknesses are?
Well, he talks about a son, but he doesn't identify him by name.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's good.
I don't see any weaknesses. I don't know, maybe I'm blind.
I'm with you, Connie.
Now, remember though that in a lot of ways we look at this through 2,000 years of Christian history,
But yeah,
and in a lot of ways, the letter to the Hebrews is sort of insufficiently appreciated because it is addressed to struggling Jewish Christians, and we have a harder time relating to struggling Jewish Christians, although we should relate to them because we frequently struggle in the same way, although we don't recognize it. So in terms of proving that there's a son at this point, the strengths and weaknesses, he starts with the wisdom tradition, identifying the Son as the wisdom of God. And that's very powerful and compelling in many ways, because we have this, in the midst of monogamy, we have this evidently independent being that's with God, that is like God, timeless, that has many of the attributes of God, that is closely related to God, that seems inseparable to God, and seems to be a divine element that kind of interfaces with humanity and brings about a knowledge of God's laws. But that's, sort of in many ways very mysterious, and on the face of it would appear to violate the tenets of monotheism. It's this whole thing, and there it is, and it's kind of unattached to everything. And so the author of Hebrews identifies that as the Son. So that's a strong point. But then he's drawing on the Psalms, on the promise of the Davidic line. And so the problem is, and especially coronation Psalms, and so the problem is that, the intent of the Psalm is that once the Davidic successor becomes king, he receives God's anointing and God's blessing. So, in some sense, there's nothing divine about that. It relates to a man. And so on the one hand, the author of Hebrews clearly emphasizes both the divinity and humanity of the Son. But on the other hand, in the traditional interpretation of these Psalms, they apply to the Davidic king at the moment of his coronation. So in some sense, he's, applying these verses as if the Son was eternal, as if the Son was something other than a son of David. Then again, that interpretation becomes a little bit rocky. So you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Today is a moment of coronation. So the author of Hebrews is saying that that moment of coronation corresponds to sitting at the right hand of the Father. But isn't that a stretch? I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. Again, that's the coronation, from a coronation psalm. Brings the firstborn into the world. He becomes firstborn by virtue of becoming king. So this is a little bit shaky. And let all God's angels worship him. His reasoning, and we just went over his chain of logic.
Mhm.
And, for us, it's very solid, but it's somewhat indirect. So we have the wisdom tradition, and we have the application, or one might call it the misapplication, or the imaginary application, depending on one's, whatever, of the coronation psalms and the promise of a Davidic king whose throne lasts forever. That's not because the person of the king lasts forever, it's because the line lasts forever. And obviously a problem here is that that's become messianic. So there's an expectation that there's going to be a new Davidic king that will arise at some point, but there's not necessarily a belief that he's going to be divine or anything other than a reestablishment of the line of the Davidic king, which will continue through his heirs. So that's sort of where we are at this point in the author's building his argument. The strongest point is the wisdom tradition, which for being reminded of it for an Orthodox Jew has to be very troubling, because there's this, sort of being floating around that seems to be kind of unattached, that really calls for some explanation and some interpretation. So is that all clear? Does anyone have any comments or thoughts?
So in this point in time, they don't even believe that, that there is a son. Still,
Still a little bit,
yeah,
a little bit murky,
yeah.
a little bit murky.
What if of God gave him a name? Let's say, Jesus. You think they'll believe it? I mean, just for the sake of argument.
No, not yet. So remember, his argument is kind of a crescendo, or actually, with the wisdom tradition, I think he starts out very strong,
Well,
then he kind of tones it down a bit.
yeah.
And so he's sort of mounting.
I think it's well established, this messianic enthronement. It's well established, even though there's no name of the son. You are my son. This day I have begotten you, right?
Right, but the question is, how does that not simply lead to him? How does that not simply apply to the person of a purely human king whom God has anointed and blessed?
Like David.
Like David,
Yeah.
or like Solomon.
Mhm.
And remember, the earliest of these, the Psalms that date to the 10th century BC, probably were in fact written for Solomon's coronation. and in the Jewish tradition, applied above all to Solomon. So so we're I mean, he's picked it up considerably with let all God's angels worship him. So the one who brings victory
Should be worshiped.
should be worshiped. And in the Song of Moses and in the Ode, it's God. We would say God the Father. And with the seated at the right hand of the Father, we have the notion that there's a Son who should be worshipped. So that kind of murkiness, I think, prepares the way for what comes next, which I think becomes not particularly murky at all. And we have sort of the wisdom tradition united with the coronation psalms and the enthronement theme to point much more clearly to the Son, and then going back and drawing back on the worship, the wisdom, the wisdom theme of wisdom literature. So shall we go on, or does anyone have any comment or questions?
Yeah, I think we should go on.
So next, in verse 8, he says, but of the Son, he says, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The righteous scepter is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated lawlessness. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness beyond your comrades. So that's his fifth quotation. And it comes from Psalm 45. Let's look at the psalm. So this is a psalm for a royal wedding. And it also has the elements of the coronation psalm. My heart overflows with the goodly theme. I address my verses to the king. My tongue is like the pen of a ready scribe. You are the fairest of the sons of men. This is addressed to the king. You are the fairest of the sons of men. Grace is poured upon your lips. Therefore, God has blessed you forever. Gird your sword upon your thigh, O mighty one, in your glory and majesty. In your majesty, ride forth victoriously for the cause of truth and to defend the right. Let your right hand teach you dread deeds. Your arrows are sharp in the heart of the king's enemies. Peoples fall under you. Your divine throne endures forever and ever. Your royal scepter is a scepter of equity. You love righteousness and hate wickedness. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness above your fellows. Your robes are all fragrant with myrrh and aloes and cassia. So in the Septuagint, that reads, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. Your righteous scepter is the scepter of your kingdom. In verse 6, the Son is addressed directly as God. But of the Son, he says, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. So the king in the psalm is being addressed as God. That is a clear violation of monotheism. That's, in fact, if it were a violation of monotheism, it would have to be an act of blasphemy and idolatry in the midst of a psalm. Also notice in verse 2, you are the fairest of the sons of men, or you are more beautiful than the sons of men.
Mhm.
There's something about the king in the psalm who's called God, and in verse 7 of the psalm, therefore God, your God, has anointed you. We have to disambiguate gods.
So the first God is the king.
Mhm.
Okay, now I get it.
So the point here is that the psalm suggests that there's, especially in the Septuagint, suggests that there's some divine being who is God, whose God is God, or some divine being who is God, whose God is Yahweh. But there can only be one God.
So it's like the king is the divine being.
The king is a divine being. The king is addressed as God.
Got it. Okay.
The king is distinct and apart from God. The king has been anointed. The king's throne is forever and ever, as God is forever and ever.
So you could see how the Jews would be confused right there, because that's how they view their king.
We have a being who is God, whose throne endures forever, being addressed as God, whose God is God,
Mhm.
whose throne endures forever, therefore is immortal, not merely a member of a dynasty that continues, but himself one who continues or has no beginning and end, which is necessarily the definition of immortal. So God, your God, disambiguates Yahweh from the king. We should
Jesus
should-
could be confused with a king who can die, but the lineage is forever. The throne is forever.
and in this, but here in this case, it's not the throne that's forever, it's the person of the king who is forever,
Right, right.
because the king is God. And the king's God is Yahweh. And somehow that can't violate principles of monotheism, because hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one.
Okay.
So this is a mounting crescendo. Here he tries to, here he I think, clearly makes a very strong case. With that said, we need to stop. We're not done with this verse yet, unfortunately. So we'll pick up again there next week. There's the part about loving righteousness. There's a debate about why it's there at all in such a carefully crafted work. Why did the author of Hebrews leave a verse from the Psalm that he didn't need to include? That seems to add no value to his argument, and indeed that argument is wrong. So we might try to think about why it is that argument is wrong. So we'll continue where we left off. And once again, we didn't get very far, but hopefully this has been useful.